The diamonds around her neck were a gift, but the papers in his hand were the real surprise. Richard Sterling thought he had calculated every variable. He had the company, the mistress, and the perfect timing to cut his trophy wife loose just before his firm's stock exploded. He looked at Victoria across the candlelight of their Christmas Eve dinner and saw only a naive woman whose usefulness had expired. He didn't see the predator sitting right in front of him. He didn't know that the signature he needed to save his empire wasn't on a contract, it was hers, and she wasn't signing anything. The silence in the penthouse was heavier than the crystal chandelier hanging above the dining table. Outside, the snow was falling over Manhattan, dusting the city in a picturesque white layer that usually signaled joy and warmth. But inside the Sterling residence on Fifth Avenue, the air conditioning seemed to be set to a permanent chill. Victoria Sterling adjusted the napkin on her lap, her eyes scanning the perfectly roasted duck that neither of them had touched. She was 32, with the kind of timeless, sharp-boned beauty that made people assume she was born into money. In reality, she was a chameleon, a woman who had learned to wear silence like armor. Across from her, Richard checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. He was handsome, in a conventional, aggressive way. Broad shoulders, expensive suit, and a jawline that suggested he was used to getting his way. At 45, Richard was the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, a logistics and tech firm currently on the verge of a breakthrough merger that would cement his status as a titan of industry. "You're distracted tonight," Victoria said softly, lifting her wine glass. "Is it the merger?" Richard flinched, as if surprised she even knew the word. He looked at her with a mix of pity and impatience. "Business is complex, Victoria. It's not something for dinner-table conversation." "I see," she murmured, taking a sip of the vintage Pinot Noir. "I thought since it's Christmas Eve you might be present." Richard sighed, a harsh, grating sound. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. For a fleeting second, Victoria wondered if it was jewelry. A bracelet, perhaps. An apology for the late nights, the unexplained absences, the scent of Chanel No. 5 on his shirts when she wore Santol 33. He pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It wasn't jewelry. He slid it across the mahogany table. It stopped just short of her wine glass. "Merry Christmas, Victoria," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I didn't want to drag this into the new year." Victoria stared at the envelope. She didn't reach for it. "What is this?" "It's freedom. For both of us," Richard said, leaning back, regaining his confidence now that the deed was done. "I've filed for divorce. My lawyer Harrison has drawn up a generous settlement. You get the house in the Hamptons, a monthly stipend for 5 years, and you keep the car. It's more than fair, considering you came into this marriage with nothing but a suitcase." Victoria's hand didn't tremble. Her heart rate didn't spike. Instead, a strange calm washed over her. She had known this was coming. A woman doesn't live with a narcissist for 7 years without learning to read the shifts in the barometric pressure of his ego. "Divorce," she repeated flatly, "on Christmas Eve." "It's a tax thing, partly." Richard shrugged, taking a bite of the duck as if a weight had been lifted. "And frankly, I'm tired of pretending. We've grown apart. I need a partner who understands my world, Victoria. Someone who can stand beside me as I take Sterling Dynamics global. You're a wonderful homemaker, really. But we're in different stratospheres now." Victoria looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the arrogance that had blinded him. He truly believed she was nothing more than the decorative ornament he had picked up at a charity gala 7 years ago. He believed the narrative he had invented, that he was the savior, and she was the lucky beneficiary. "Is this about Chloe?" Victoria asked. Richard choked slightly on his wine. He slammed the glass down. "Leave her out of this. This is about us." "So it is about Chloe," Victoria corrected, her voice still frighteningly even. "Your 24-year-old executive assistant, the one who thinks equity is a type of horse." "She understands me," Richard snapped, his face reddening. "She supports my vision, and she doesn't sit there judging me with those cold eyes." "Look, sign the papers, Victoria. Don't make this ugly. If you fight me, I have lawyers who will ensure you leave with nothing. I have the best legal team in New York. You have, what, a library card?" He laughed at his own joke. It was a cruel, sharp sound. Victoria reached out and picked up the envelope. She felt the weight of the paper. "You're right, Richard. You are about to enter a very complex time with the company. The merger with the Blackwood Group is contingent on your solvency and reputation, isn't it?" Richard narrowed his eyes. "How do you know about Blackwood?" "I read," she said simply. "I read everything you leave lying around." "It doesn't matter what you read," Richard scoffed. "The deal is done. We sign on January 5th. By then, I want this divorce finalized. I want to walk into that boardroom a free man." Victoria stood up. She looked tall, statuesque in her emerald green silk dress. She walked over to the fireplace where a fire was crackling warmly, contrasting the ice in the room. "You want to be a free man," she said, turning to face him. "You want to trade me in for a newer model because you think you've outgrown me. You think you are the source of all the power in this room." "I am the source of the power," Richard said, standing up aggressively. "I pay for the food you eat, the clothes on your back, and the roof over your head. Without me, you're a waitress from Ohio." Victoria smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf watching a lamb strut toward a cliff. "Enjoy your dinner, Richard," she said softly. "I'll review the papers, but remember one thing. Be careful what you wish for on Christmas. You might just get it." She turned and walked out of the dining room, the envelope tucked under her arm. As she ascended the grand staircase, she heard Richard mutter, "Delusional bitch," before pouring himself another glass of wine. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea that the waitress from Ohio had been investing her monthly allowance in high-risk tech stocks for 7 years. He didn't know that she had turned his generous housekeeping budget into a diversified portfolio. And most importantly, he didn't know that the mysterious angel investor group, Nemesis Holdings, which currently owned 40% of the Blackwood Group, the very company he needed to merge with, was solely owned by Victoria Sterling. Richard had just declared war on his own boss. The next morning, Christmas Day, Richard was gone before Victoria woke up. She found a note on the kitchen counter. "Gone to Aspen for the week. Have the papers signed by the time I'm back. Don't be difficult." Victoria crumbled to the note and dropped it into the trash compactor. She made herself a double espresso, enjoying the silence of the empty penthouse. She didn't cry. She had done her crying 3 years ago when she found the first hotel receipt in his jacket pocket. Since then, she had been planning. She walked into Richard's home office. It was a shrine to his ego-framed magazine covers of himself awards for Innovator of the Year, and a massive mahogany desk. She sat in his leather chair. It was too big for her, but she liked the view. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number that was saved under pizza delivery. "Merry Christmas, Victoria." A deep, gravelly voice answered on the second ring. "Merry Christmas, Nathaniel," she replied. Nathaniel Thorne was not a pizza delivery guy. He was a corporate shark, a man Richard hated with a passion because Nathaniel was everything Richard wasn't, self-made, discreet, and lethally smart. He was also Victoria's proxy at Nemesis Holdings. "Did he do it?" Nathaniel asked. "He did," Victoria said, spinning a heavy Mont Blanc pen between her fingers. "Served me papers over roast duck, offered me the Hamptons shack and a pittance. The arrogance is almost impressive." Nathaniel chuckled. "Does he have any idea that Nemesis Holdings just increased its stake in his company's debt this morning?" "None. He's too busy skiing in Aspen with his assistant," Victoria said. "He thinks the merger with Blackwood is a done deal. He thinks he's walking into a coronation on January 5th. "And you want to turn it into an execution," Nathaniel concluded. "I want to destroy him, Nathaniel," Victoria said, her voice dropping an octave. "Not just financially. I want to dismantle his reputation. I want him to know that the woman he called a waitress is the one pulling the plug on his life support." "The shareholder meeting is set for January 5th, Nathaniel said, the sound of typing clicking in the background. "The agenda includes the vote on the merger. Richard needs a majority vote. He owns 30%. The board owns 20%. He thinks the remaining 50% is scattered among small investors he can bully. But Nemesis Holdings has been quietly buying up that float for 18 months, Victoria reminded him. "We have 41% of the voting rights as of this morning," Nathaniel confirmed. "We are the majority. Nothing happens without us. What are your instructions, boss?" Victoria looked out the window at the snowy skyline of Manhattan. She saw the building where Richard's company was headquartered, a towering glass needle piercing the sky. "Let him have his week in Aspen," Victoria said. "Let him feel like a king. Let him spend money he doesn't have on jewelry for Chloe. When he comes back for the meeting, I want you to be there. As Nemesis, and Nathaniel. Tell the lawyers to draft a counter-proposal for the divorce. I don't want the Hamptons house." "What do you want?" "I want everything," she whispered. "I want the penthouse. I want the liquidity. And I want his seat on the board." There was a pause on the line, followed by a low whistle of appreciation. "That's brutal, Victoria. I love it. I'll see you in the war room." She hung up the phone and walked to the safe hidden behind a painting of a storm-tossed ship. She punched in the code, Richard's birthday, naturally. He was too narcissistic to use anything else. Inside, she found what she was looking for: the financial records Richard had been hiding from the IRS. The creative accounting that kept Sterling Dynamics looking profitable when it was actually bleeding cash. He thought he was hiding it from the authorities. He thought his wife was too stupid to understand a balance sheet. She took the files out and placed them on the desk. She snapped a photo of the cover page and sent it to Nathaniel. Caption ammunition. Her phone buzzed immediately. Received. "This is nuclear." Victoria stood up and walked to the mirror in the hallway. She looked at her reflection. The sad, neglected wife was gone. In her place was a CEO in waiting. Richard wanted a partner who understood his world. He was about to find out that she didn't just understand his world, she owned it. Meanwhile, in Aspen, Richard was popping a bottle of Dom Perignon in a private chalet. Chloe, a blonde with a laugh that sounded like tinkling glass, was draped over his arm. "To us?" Richard toasted, clinking his glass against hers. "And to the single life." "Are you sure she won't cause trouble, Richie?" Chloe asked, pouting. "Wives can be so clingy." "Victoria." Richard laughed, throwing his head back. "Honey, Victoria doesn't have the spine to fight a parking ticket, let alone me. She'll sign, she'll take the check, and she'll disappear. She's a nobody." He took a long swig of the champagne, the cold bubbles burning his throat. He felt invincible. He was Richard Sterling. He won. That was just what he did. He didn't notice his phone buzzing on the table. It was a notification from his bank. A small, insignificant alert about a freeze on his joint credit line due to suspicious activity. He ignored it. It was probably just Victoria buying groceries. He had no idea that the freeze wasn't because of spending. It was because the primary guarantor of the account Victoria Sterling had just withdrawn her backing. The avalanche had started, and Richard was standing right in its path, looking the other way. The air in Aspen was thinner than in New York, a fact Richard Sterling was reminded of as he stood in the center of the Van Cleef and Arpels boutique, struggling to catch his breath. But it wasn't the altitude that was suffocating him. It was the polite, pitying smile of the sales associate. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling," the associate said, her voice lowered to a discreet whisper that somehow made the situation 10 times more humiliating. "The card has been declined. Code 05. Do not honor." Richard stared at the platinum credit card on the glass counter as if it were a dead insect. Beside him, Chloe was practically vibrating with impatience. She had already tried on the diamond pendant, a staggering $40,000 piece of ice, and posted a selfie with it on Instagram, captioned, "Spoiled." "Try it again," Richard snapped, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "There's no limit on that card. I'm Richard Sterling." "I recognize you, sir," the associate said, her smile tightening. "But the issuer is adamant. The primary account holder has placed a total freeze on all supplementary cards due to security concerns." "Primary account holder," Richard barked, causing a couple browsing engagement rings to look over. "I am the CEO of Sterling Dynamics. I make the money." "Technically, sir," the woman said, looking at her screen. "This is a joint account established under the Sterling Family Trust, and the primary signatory is listed as Mrs. Victoria Sterling." The name hit him like a physical slap. He had forgotten. Years ago, when they were first married, and he was leveraging every asset he had to float the company during a rough patch, he had put the personal assets in Victoria's name to protect them from corporate liability lawsuits. He had meant to change it back a dozen times, but never got around to it. It was a housekeeping detail, something he deemed beneath his notice. Now that detail was preventing him from buying his mistress a Christmas present. "Richard," Chloe whined, tugging on his sleeve. "This is embarrassing. People are looking. Just use another card." He patted his pockets. He had left his corporate card in the hotel safe. His personal debit card had a daily limit that wouldn't cover the tax on this necklace. "We'll come back," Richard hissed, grabbing Chloe's arm a little too roughly. "There's been a clerical error." "You promised me the necklace," Chloe complained as he dragged her out into the snowy street. "You said you were the king of New York kings don't get their cards declined." "Shut up, Chloe," Richard snapped. It was the first time he had ever raised his voice at her. She recoiled, her eyes welling with crocodile tears, but Richard was too busy dialing his banker in New York. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling," the banker said, sounding terrified. Mrs. Sterling came in personally this morning with her legal counsel. She invoked the spousal protection clause of the trust. She claimed she suspects you are dissipating marital assets prior to a divorce filing. She's frozen everything that isn't strictly the company's operating account. "She can't do that," Richard screamed, oblivious to the passers-by staring at him. "It's my money. It's marital money, sir. And until a judge says otherwise, she has equal control. Actually, since she's the primary trustee, she has superior control." Richard hung up and hurled his phone into a snowbank. He had to scramble into the snow to retrieve it a moment later, cursing vilely as the freezing powder went up his sleeves. Victoria. He had underestimated the level of pettiness she was capable of. He thought she would weep, beg, perhaps write him a sad letter. He didn't think she would cut off his cash flow while he was on vacation. "She wants to play hardball," Richard muttered, wiping his wet phone on his coat. "Fine. I'll evict her from the penthouse the second we land." Back in New York, Victoria was not playing. She was working. The penthouse was silent, transformed into a war room. The dining table where Richard had served the divorce papers was now covered in stacks of documents. Sitting across from her was Nathaniel Thorne, looking sharp in a charcoal suit, and a forensic accountant named Evelyn. "It's worse than we thought," Evelyn said, adjusting her glasses. She pushed a ledger toward Victoria. "Richard hasn't just been cooking the books to boost the stock price for the merger. He's been siphoning funds from the R&D department to pay for his lifestyle. That business trip to Macau last year, $200,000 in gambling debts, paid for by the company." "Embezzlement," Victoria said, her voice cold. "Textbook." Nathaniel agreed. "If this comes out before the merger, the stock tanks. Richard goes to prison. But if the stock tanks, your equity in Nemesis Holdings loses value too." Victoria looked at the papers. "I don't care about the money, Nathaniel. I have enough money to live 10 lifetimes. This isn't about profit. It's about the purge." "So what's the play?" Nathaniel asked. "We expose him now." "No," Victoria said, standing up and walking to the window. The city lights were flickering on. "If we expose him now, the board will just fire him quietly to save face. They'll give him a golden parachute and hush money. He'll walk away rich and play the victim." She turned back to them, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous intelligence. "I want him to walk into that boardroom on January 5th, believing he is a god. I want him to stand at the head of the table and pitch the merger. I want him to feel the height of his success, and then I want to take the floor." Nathaniel grinned. "You're going to reveal yourself as the majority shareholder at the meeting. I'm going to reveal myself as his judge, jury, and executioner," Victoria corrected. The elevator chimed. It was the private service elevator. A courier stepped out carrying a garment bag branded with the logo of Dior. "Your dress for the Blackwood Gala." "Mrs. Sterling," the courier said. "Thank you," Victoria said. "You're going to the gala?" Evelyn asked, surprised. "Richard will be there, with her." "I know," Victoria said, unzipping the bag slightly to reveal a fabric that shimmered like liquid midnight. "Richard filed for divorce, but we are technically still married. It would be rude of me not to support my husband at the most important social event of the season." "He's going to lose his mind," Nathaniel noted. "That's the plan," Victoria replied. "He thinks I'm a discarded wife hiding in the Hamptons. He needs to see that I'm not hiding. I'm hunting." The annual Blackwood Winter Gala was the kind of event where the net worth of the attendees exceeded the GDP of small countries. Held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it was a sea of tuxedos, designer gowns, and superficial air kisses. This year, the buzz was all about the pending merger between Sterling Dynamics and the Blackwood Group. It was the marriage of logistics and tech, a deal worth billions. Richard Sterling arrived in a stretch limousine, stepping onto the red carpet with the confidence of a man who owned the sidewalk. He wore a bespoke tuxedo, and on his arm was Chloe. She was wearing a bright red dress that was too tight, too low cut, and far too loud for the old money crowd attending the event. It screamed mistress, but Richard was too arrogant to see the side eyes he was receiving. He had managed to secure a temporary line of credit from a shady private lender to cover his expenses until he could fix the Victoria situation. He felt back in control. "Smile, babe," Richard whispered to Chloe as the cameras flashed. "You're with the man of the hour." "They love us," Chloe beamed, waving at a photographer who was actually trying to get a shot of the celebrity behind them. They made their way into the great hall, grabbing champagne flutes. Richard scanned the room for Alexander Blackwood, the CEO of the company he intended to acquire. He needed to smooth over a few details before the vote on the 5th. "Richard," a voice boomed. It was distinctive, but it wasn't Alexander. It was Harrison Richards' lawyer. He looked pale. "Harrison, not now," Richard said, sipping his drink. "I'm working the room." "You need to see this," Harrison hissed, pulling Richard behind a large Egyptian statue. He held up his phone. The guest list. It was just updated. "So who's here, the mayor?" "No. Look at the VIP table, table 1, the head table with Alexander Blackwood." Richard squinted at the screen. Host Alexander Blackwood, guests of honor. The board of Nemesis Holdings. "Nemesis Holdings," Richard scoffed. "The investor group, good. I need to meet them. I need to charm them into voting my way. Read the name of the Nemesis representative, Richard." Richard looked down. Under Nemesis Holdings representative, it didn't list a corporate lawyer or a faceless proxy. It read, Mrs. Victoria Sterling. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "That's a mistake. It's a typo. Victoria is at home crying over a pint of ice cream." "Is she?" Harrison whispered, pointing toward the grand staircase. The room had gone quiet. A hush rippled through the crowd, starting from the entrance and spreading like a wave. Descending the stairs was Victoria. She was not the modest, quiet wife Richard had kept in the background for 7 years. She was a vision of dark power. She wore a black velvet gown that hugged every curve, with a slit that went up to her thigh, revealing a leg that looked like it could crush a man's ego. Around her neck was not the delicate pearls Richard usually forced her to wear, but a massive, complex diamond choker that looked dangerously sharp. She didn't look down. She looked straight ahead, her chin raised, moving with a predatory grace. "Who is that?" Chloe asked loudly, her voice cutting through the silence. "That," Harrison murmured, "is your wife, Richard." Victoria reached the bottom of the stairs. Alexander Blackwood, a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and eyes like flint, walked past Richard without even a nod. He went straight to Victoria. He took her hand and kissed it. "Victoria, you look devastating. Thank you for coming." "I wouldn't miss it, Alexander," Victoria said, her voice smooth and carrying effortlessly. "We have so much to celebrate." Richard snapped. He shoved his champagne glass into Chloe's hand and marched across the room. He couldn't help himself. The sight of her, his Victoria being treated like royalty while he was ignored, was too much for his narcissism to handle. "Victoria!" he barked, interrupting Alexander. Victoria turned slowly. She looked at Richard as if he were a waiter who had brought the wrong order. Her eyes swept over him, then landed on Chloe, who had scurried up behind him. "Hello, Richard," she said pleasantly. "And?" "Chloe is it, the assistant." "Don't play games," Richard hissed, grabbing her elbow. "What are you doing here, and why is your name listed under the investor group?" Victoria looked at his hand on her arm, until he let go, unsettled by her gaze. "I was invited, Richard. Unlike your +1, who I assume is here to take notes for the Monday meeting." Chloe bristled. "I'm here as his partner." "Partner?" Victoria laughed. It was a soft, dark sound. "Honey, you're not a partner. You're a liability." "Listen to me," Richard said, lowering his voice, his face red. "Go home. You're embarrassing yourself. You don't belong in this room. These are serious people, Victoria, not a housewife's book club." Alexander Blackwood stepped forward, his expression thunderous. Is there a problem here, Mr. Sterling? I'm just handling a domestic issue, Alexander, Richard said, putting on a fake smile. My wife is confused. She's leaving. Actually, Victoria interrupted, I think Richard is the confused one. Alexander, shall we sit? My feet are killing me in these heels, and I want to discuss the Q4 projections for the merger. Richard froze. You discuss projections. Victoria leaned in close to Richard, close enough that he could smell the expensive perfume, Baccarat Rouge, not the sandalwood he remembered. You really didn't read the papers I sent you, did you? She whispered. You were so busy rushing to Aspen. You assume Nemesis Holdings is a group of old men in suits. Did you never wonder where the name came from, Nemesis? The goddess of divine retribution against those who succumb to hubris. She patted his cheek. I am the investor, Richard. I own 41% of the debt you're trying to restructure. I own the hand that feeds you. And on January the 5th, I'm going to bite. She pulled away and took Alexander's arm. Come, Alexander. I need a drink. Something strong. I've been dealing with children all day. They walked away toward the VIP table, leaving Richard standing in the middle of the room. The cameras flashed, capturing the look of utter hollow shock on his face. Richard? Chloe whined. What did she mean? Is she rich? Richard didn't answer. He watched his wife sit at the head of the table. A waiter poured her wine. She laughed at something Alexander said, looking radiant, powerful, and utterly untouchable. For the first time in his life, Richard Sterling felt a cold pit of fear open up in his stomach. He looked at the room full of people he thought he impressed, and he realized they weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at her. He had filed for divorce to get rid of a burden. Instead, he had just unchained a monster. We're leaving, Richard muttered. But I want dessert, Chloe protested. We are leaving now, Richard shouted, causing heads to turn again. He dragged her toward the exit, his mind racing. She was bluffing. She had to be bluffing. There was no way the woman who clipped coupons for groceries was a corporate raider. It was impossible. But as he sat in the limo watching the city pass by, the image of her name on the guest list burned in his mind. Nemesis. He pulled out his phone and called his lawyer again. Harrison, Richard said, his voice shaking. I don't care what it costs. Get me a background check on Nemesis Holdings. Find out who the signatories are. Dig deep. If she's telling the truth. If she's telling the truth, Richard, Harrison replied, his voice grim. Then you didn't just file for divorce. You signed your own death warrant. The car drove into the dark tunnel, and Richard felt like he was descending into a grave he had dug for himself. The days between Christmas and the New Year are usually a blur of relaxation and festivities. For Richard Sterling, they were a descent into a living hell. After the humiliation at the Blackwood Gala, Richard retreated not to his penthouse, which he found locked, his biometric access revoked, but to a suite at the St. Regis paid for, with the last active credit card. He could find a corporate emergency card that he prayed the finance department wouldn't flag until January. Chloe had abandoned him in the lobby of the hotel the moment his second card declined at the bar. Call me when you're rich again, she had sneered, taking an Uber back to the apartment. He paid for an apartment whose lease, Richard realized with a sinking heart, was also under the family trust. Alone in the hotel room, surrounded by empty minibar bottles, Richard finally did what he should have done years ago. He looked into his wife. Harrison, tell me you have something, Richard barked into the phone. It was 3:00 a.m. on December 28th. He hadn't slept in 48 hours. I have answers, Harrison said, his voice groggy and filled with a strange mixture of awe and fear. But you're not going to like them. Spit it out. Is Nemesis Holdings a shell company? Is she fronting for someone? Maybe her father left her money I didn't know about. No, Richard. It's her. It's all her. Harrison paused, the sound of shuffling papers coming through the line. I had my PI dig into the financials of Nemesis. The initial seed capital didn't come from an inheritance. It came from the market. The market Victoria doesn't know. A stock from a stocking stuffer. Richard scoffed, pacing the room in his bathrobe. Do you remember 8 years ago, right before you met her, the market crash of 17? Yeah, I lost a bundle. Everyone did. Not everyone, Harrison corrected. There was an anonymous trader handled through a blind broker in Zurich who shorted the housing market with surgical precision. They turned $50,000 into $12 million in 3 weeks. The financial press called the trader the Silent Knife. Nobody knew who it was. Richard stopped pacing. A cold sweat broke out on his neck. No, that's an urban legend. It's Victoria, Harrison said softly. We traced the IP address of the initial trades. They came from a small apartment in Ohio. Her apartment. And Richard? She didn't stop there. For the last 7 years, while you were dragging her to galas and treating her like a trophy, she's been running a high-frequency trading algorithm from her laptop, an algorithm she wrote. Richard dropped onto the bed. He remembered the nights he came home late, finding Victoria awake in the library, typing on her sleek laptop. He had always assumed she was shopping or browsing Pinterest. He had mocked her little hobbies. She's a math prodigy, Richard. Harrison continued, hammering the nails into the coffin. She has a double master's in applied mathematics and economics from MIT. She changed her name after graduation to distance herself from a family debt scandal, which is why you didn't see it on the background check when you married her. You married a genius and treated her like a dimwit. Richard felt like the room was spinning. He had lectured her on business. He had explained inflation to her like she was a child. She must have been laughing at him the entire time. Okay, Richard whispered, his throat dry. Okay, so she's rich. She's smart. But she's still my wife. Fiduciary duty works both ways. She can't destroy my company just because she's mad. She's not destroying it, Richard, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a whisper. She's acquiring it. I looked at the bylaws of Nemesis Holdings. Their mission statement isn't profit. It's ethical restructuring of mismanaged assets. She thinks you're incompetent, and based on the file she sent to the SEC this morning, she can prove it. She went to the SEC, Richard screamed. She sent them the receipts, Richard. The Aspen trips the diamond earrings for Chloe charged to office supplies, the gambling debts in Macau. It's all there. She's not just coming for your job. She's coming for your freedom. Richard hung up the phone. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the device. He needed a plan. He needed leverage. He dressed quickly, throwing on wrinkled clothes. He had to get to the office. There had to be something in his private safe that could incriminate her. Maybe he could claim she hacked him. Maybe he could plant something. It was a desperate, sloppy thought, but he was a desperate man. He took a taxi to the Sterling Dynamics Tower. The building was dark, a monolith of glass and steel against the winter night. He swiped his keycard at the executive entrance. Beep. Access denied. He swiped it again. Access denied. Problem, Mr. Sterling. Richard spun around. Standing in the shadows of the lobby was the head of security, a man named Miller, whom Richard had employed for 10 years. Miller. Thank God, Richard said, rushing to the glass doors. My card is demagnetized. Let me in. I need to get to the 40th floor. Miller didn't move. He stood with his arms crossed, looking at Richard through the glass with a blank expression. I can't do that, sir, Miller said. What do you mean you can't? I'm the CEO. Not as of 600 p.m. tonight, Miller said. The board of directors held an emergency teleconference. Due to pending investigations by the SEC and the freezing of company assets by our primary creditor, you have been placed on administrative leave pending the shareholder meeting on January 5th. You are barred from the premises. Who called the meeting? Richard demanded, pounding on the glass. Who authorized this? Miller pointed a finger upward toward the penthouse level of the building across the street. The chairman of the creditor committee, Miller said. Mrs. Sterling. Richard looked up. Across the street in the rival building where Nemesis Holdings had leased temporary office space, a single light was on. He could see a silhouette standing at the window looking down. It was her. She was watching him. She wasn't hiding in the Hamptons. She wasn't crying. She was literally overseeing his destruction from a vantage point of power. Richard slumped against the glass door. The snow began to fall again, covering his expensive Italian shoes. He had no office. He had no home. He had no mistress. And in 5 days, he would have to face her in the boardroom. He pulled out his phone and dialed the one number he swore he would never call for help. Victoria. He pleaded when the voicemail beeped. Victoria, please. Let's talk. I made a mistake. A huge mistake. We can fix this. I'll fire Chloe. I'll give you half the company. Just stop this. Don't send me to prison. I'm your husband. He ended the call. He stared at the phone, waiting for a ring back. It never came. Instead, a text message popped up from his bank. Alert, automatic payment for Lamborghini lease. Failed. Insufficient funds. Richard laughed, a manic, broken sound that echoed in the empty street. He sat down on the curb, the snow piling up around him, waiting for a morning that would bring no warmth. January 5th dawned with a sky the color of a bruised plum. The air in the conference room on the 40th floor of Sterling Dynamics was so tense it felt like a spark could ignite the oxygen. The long mahogany table was fully occupied. The 12 members of the board of directors sat in stiff silence. They were men and women Richard had known for years. People he had golfed with, dined with, and manipulated. Today they wouldn't meet his eyes. Richard sat at the far end of the table. He looked like a ghost of his former self. His suit, usually impeccably pressed, hung slightly loose on his frame. He had lost 10 pounds in a week. There were dark circles under his eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. He was fighting for his life, and he knew it. The meeting will come to order, announced the chairman of the board, a stout man named Frederick, who had always been Richard's staunch ally. Frederick's voice was shaky. We are here to vote on the proposed merger with the Blackwood Group, Frederick said, and to address the internal motions brought forward by our majority debt holder. The double doors at the end of the room opened. Richard flinched. Victoria walked in. She wasn't wearing the soft pastels she used to wear to please him. She was wearing a sharp white suit, the color of mourning in some cultures, the color of ice in others. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. She carried nothing but a thin tablet. Flanking her were Nathaniel Thorne and Alexander Blackwood. Richard's breath hitched. Alexander was sitting on her side of the table. Mrs. Sterling. Frederick nodded, sweating. Please take a seat. Victoria didn't sit. She walked to the head of the table, the seat opposite Richard. She placed the tablet on the wood with a soft click. Gentlemen and Richard, she began, her voice calm and authoritative. I am not here today as a wife. I am here as the owner of Nemesis Holdings. which currently controls 51% of the voting shares of this company, acquired through the debt for equity swap, triggered by your default 3 days ago." "We didn't default," Richard interrupted, his voice cracking. "It was a clerical error." "You froze the accounts. I froze the personal accounts that were being used to drain the company." Victoria corrected, her eyes locking onto his. "The company defaulted because it is insolvent, Richard. Because you have hollowed it out." She tapped her tablet. The massive screen on the wall flickered to life. It wasn't a PowerPoint presentation about synergy. It was a forensic dissection of Richard's life. Slide 1. The R&D budget. Here we see $2.4 million allocated to Project Horizon. Victoria narrated. "There is no Project Horizon. There is, however, a villa in Tuscany, purchased under the name of a shell company linked to one Ms. Chloe Miller." The board members gasped. Richard shrank in his chair. Slide 2. The tax evasion. Here are the altered logs sent to the IRS versus the real logs kept on Richard's private server. Victoria continued. "This is federal fraud carrying a minimum sentence of 10 years. "That's enough." Richard slammed his hand on the table, standing up. "You're framing me. You're vindictive because I left you. You didn't leave me, Richard," Victoria said, her voice cutting through his shouting like a razor. "You tried to discard me. There is a difference." She walked slowly down the length of the table toward him. The room was deathly silent. "You told me on Christmas Eve that you needed a partner who understood your world," she said, stopping inches from him. She was tall in her heels, looking him dead in the eye. "You were right. You did need someone who understood the numbers, the leverage, the power." She leaned in. "I understood it so well I bought it." She turned back to the board. "Nemesis Holdings puts forth a motion. Immediate termination of Richard Sterling as CEO for cause, clawback of all bonuses from the last 5 years to repay the embezzled funds, and a recommendation to the district attorney for full cooperation in criminal proceedings." "Seconded," Alexander Blackwood said immediately. "All in favor?" Frederick asked weakly. 12 hands went up. Even Frederick raised his hand. Richard looked around the room. Betrayal. Absolute betrayal. "You can't do this," Richard whispered. "I built this company." "You built a house of cards," Victoria said. "And I just opened a window." "Alexander," Richard pleaded, turning to the man he thought was his savior. "The merger. You need me for the transition." Alexander looked at Richard with cold disdain. "Richard, my deal was never with you. It was with the solvency of Sterling Dynamics. Victoria approached me 6 months ago. She showed me the cracks in your foundation. We've been planning this restructuring since July. The merger is happening. But you aren't part of the package." Richard fell back into his chair. 6 months. She had been planning this for 6 months while he was lying to her face about late nights at the office. She was already negotiating his exit. "Security," Victoria said calmly. The doors opened again. Miller, the head of security, stepped in, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. "Richard Sterling," one of the officers said, stepping forward with handcuffs. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and securities fraud." Richard stared at the handcuffs. The cold metal snapped around his wrists, the same wrists that had worn a Rolex yesterday. "Victoria," he croaked as they hauled him up. "Victoria, please. Don't let them take me." Victoria didn't look away. She didn't smile. There was no joy in her face, only a terrible blank finality. "You wanted a divorce, Richard," she said softly. Consider this the settlement. She turned her back on him and sat down in the CEO's chair. Get him out of my boardroom, she ordered, as Richard was dragged out, screaming and crying, begging for mercy. Victoria picked up the gavel at the head of the table. She looked at the board, who were terrified, respectful and ready to follow her command. Now, Victoria said, smoothing her skirt, let's discuss the Q1 roadmap. We have a lot of work to do to clean up this mess. The door slammed shut, cutting off Richard's wails. Inside, the air was clean. The parasite had been removed. The Queen had taken her throne, and the silence that followed was the sound of absolute victory. 1 year later, the snow fell over Manhattan, just as it had on the night Richard served the divorce papers. But inside the penthouse on Fifth Avenue, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The chill was gone, replaced by the warmth of a fire that cracked for a room full of genuine laughter. Victoria stood by the window holding a glass of vintage wine, a bottle she had bought for herself. She looked out at the city. Her city. In the 12 months since the boardroom coup, Sterling Dynamics had ceased to exist. It was now Nemesis Blackwood Logistics, a titan of industry that had posted record profits in 3 consecutive quarters. The stock price hadn't just recovered, it had tripled. Victoria, as the CEO and majority shareholder, was no longer the invisible wife. She was on the cover of Forbes this month. The headline read, "The Silent Storm: How Victoria Sterling Redefined Corporate Power." "You're brooding again," a voice called out. Victoria turned to see Nathaniel. He was no longer just her proxy, he was her chief operating officer. And judging by the way he looked at her, perhaps something more in the future, though Victoria was in no rush. She was enjoying her independence too much. Not brooding. Victoria smiled. Reflecting. Thinking about him? Nathaniel asked, walking over to join her by the window. Briefly, she admitted. It is Christmas Eve, after all. Richard was currently residing in a minimum security federal facility in upstate New York. He had taken a plea deal to avoid the maximum sentence for embezzlement and fraud. He was serving 5 years. His assets had been seized to pay restitution to the company. The Hamptons house was sold. The cars were auctioned. Even his bespoke suits had been liquidated. The last Victoria heard, Chloe had visited him exactly once to ask if she could keep the leased apartment. When Richard explained he couldn't pay for it anymore, she had blocked his number and was reportedly dating a hedge fund manager in Miami. I received a letter from him yesterday, Victoria said, gesturing to a sealed envelope on the mantel. Did you open it? No, Victoria said simply. I don't need to read his apologies, Nathaniel. And I certainly don't need his forgiveness. He filed for divorce to be free. I simply gave him exactly what he asked for. He is free of me, and I am free of him. She picked up the envelope and tossed it into the fireplace. The paper curled, blackened, and burst into flame, vanishing into ash within seconds. The board is waiting for you in the dining room, Nathaniel said softly. Alexander wants to propose a toast to the new year. Victoria smoothed her dress a deep crimson silk that made her look like royalty. She looked at her reflection in the glass. The scared woman who had sat at that dining table a year ago, terrified of losing her lifestyle, was dead. In her place was a woman who had built her own empire from the wreckage of a bad marriage. Let's go, Victoria said, turning away from the window and the cold, dark city outside. I have a company to run. As she walked back into the warmth of the party, surrounded by people who respected her, not for who she married, but for who she was, Victoria realized something profound. Richard had thought the diamonds were the most valuable thing in this house. He had been wrong. The most valuable thing was the woman he had underestimated. And as the clock struck midnight, ringing in a new year, Victoria. Sterling raised her glass. She had won the war, kept the spoils, and most importantly, she had reclaimed her life. Richard Sterling spent his life believing that power was something you displayed, loud voices, expensive suits, and flashy cars. He thought his wife Victoria was nothing more than a background character in the movie of his life. But he learned the hard way that true power is often silent. It hides in the fine print, in the patience of a listener, and in the mind of someone who is constantly underestimated. Victoria didn't just survive her husband's betrayal, she masterminded a revolution. She proved that when you push a loyal person too far, you don't get a victim, you get a nemesis. Richard wanted a divorce on Christmas, and he got one. But he lost everything else in the process. It's a stark reminder to everyone. Be careful who you step on while climbing the ladder, because they might just be the one holding it up. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal revenge and the ultimate power move, please give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more stories like this. What would you have done if you were in Victoria's shoes? Would you have taken the settlement, or would you have burned his empire to the ground like she did? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. We have plenty more drama coming your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.